Okay, I think we're going to start, and I want to take a moment to welcome everyone who's joined us live and those who are watching on videotape. I'm pleased to welcome you to our fourth E4 Brown Bag for the 2023-24 school year. I'm Paul Gorin. I'm the director of the E4 Center here at the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University. These brown bags continue a set of discussions that we have had this year that engages colleagues from the E4 Center, the School of Education and Social Policy, our colleagues at Curriculum Associates, and our district partners. This initiative really originated from our E4 convening, our in-person convening last May, where we formed a learning community with members from the Chicago Public Schools, Oakland Public Schools, and several other school districts, including several of you who are here today. The key takeaway from that in-person session was a unanimous desire to do more in-person events, and importantly, to create and sustain our learning community over time. So we started a brown bag series, a virtual brown bag series, and which allows us to extend beyond our in-person events and to foster a learning community over time through discussions like we're doing today. If you didn't get a chance to catch the last few talks that we've had, Lex will be dropping links into the recording, links to the recordings into the chat here today. For today's talk, we're really excited to welcome our colleagues, Emma Adam and Sarah Collier Villaume. Dr. Emma Adam is a developmental psychologist here at Northwestern. She's an expert on stress, sleep, and the effects of on a range of outcomes among children, adolescents, and young adults. Dr. Adam is the Edwina S. Terry Professor of Human Development and Social Policy at the School of Education and Social Policy, as well as a faculty fellow at Northwestern's Institute for Policy Research. Dr. Sarah Collier Villaume is a stress researcher who studies how changes in stress exposure matters for young people's education, health, and well-being. She received her PhD here in the Human Development and Social Policy program at the School of Education and Social Policy in 2022. And most importantly, she works with us as a postdoctoral research fellow here at the E4 Center. So with that, please take it away, Emma and Sarah. Happy to have you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen and my slides, and we'll get going. All right, so I gave you a little bit of a vague title. It said Stress Disparities, Implications for School-Based Interventions. And I had high hopes of talking about all sorts of interventions that we have underway, but then I realized it was just too much. So we're going to focus on one intervention today, and we're going to focus on adolescent stress disparities. We're going to give you an introduction to this and talk about implications for a school-based intervention. This research comes to you from the COAST Lab, the Context of Adolescent Stress and Thriving Lab. We want to thank our funders who are listed here, all the various members of the lab throughout the years that have contributed to this research, including Sarah. And we also want to thank our participants in our study, as well as our school partners that have made this research possible. So we're going to give you a different perspective on stress today, one that you perhaps are aware of but don't think as much about. And that is a biological perspective on stress. So stress is more than a feeling. It sets into motion biological responses in the body that have implications both for immediate functioning as well as for long-term health and attainment. There are actually multiple stress-sensitive systems in the body that we could talk about, and that would take a good couple of days. We actually hold a biomarker workshop where we study all those systems at Northwestern. But today we're going to focus on systems that I focus on that are relevant for cognition and learning, as well as for health outcomes. and also the systems that are malleable in adolescence. And those systems include the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis, also known as the HPA axis, or mostly we'll be referring to cortisol, which is the primary product of that axis and one of the major stress hormones in the body. We'll also be talking about sleep hours and quality. Sleep is often considered a behavior, but any of you who've had a stressful period in your life know that sleep is also sensitive to stress and matters a lot for your functioning, both in the next day and in the long run. So these are the two systems we study, and we study them in this context of this broad model here. And the center of our model is diary studies. So we do measure everyday experiences in adolescents primarily, in which we ask them repeatedly at moments across the day through their cell phones, how they're feeling, what they're doing, what they're thinking, and then we pair that with measures of biological stress system activity, including cortisol levels, which we measure from small samples of saliva. So you didn't know you were going to hear about spit today, but that's how we measure our stress hormones. We also measure sleep processes through sleep watches. These used to be kind of obscure things that I would share with people 20 years ago, and now everybody has one. Fitbits, we have more expensive research grade watches. So we look at how everyday experiences relate to biological stress system activities, sleep processes, and then in turn, how those everyday those stress hormone and sleep processes have implications for emotional health, physical health, cognition, and academic outcomes. Now, we don't see everyday stress as something that just happens. Everyday stress is embedded in broader social context, both in the context of ongoing chronic social and emotional stressors in students' family lives and neighborhoods and school situations, and in the context of ongoing resources and supports in those same contexts. And all of that is embedded in broader socio-political, cultural, and policy environment. Again, this used in historical environment, this used to be a point that I would have to make, but having just lived through the pandemic and the events of the many socio-political events of the past couple of years, I think this is now on everybody's mind, that we can't think of everyday stress without thinking of these broader social contexts that and historical contexts that affect that stress. So the stress we're going to focus on today, and the stress disparities that we're going to focus on today, is racial disparities in stress. So racial disparities in stress exist, with higher stress among individuals and students of color. Some of these stress disparities come from social structural factors, such as poverty, under-resourced school and neighborhood environments. But some of these sources of stress are just due to being the member of a stigmatized ethnic or racial group. We call this race-based stress. And these include things like racial discrimination, racial microaggressions, stereotype threat, as well as the ongoing memory and anticipation of all of these. And I'm going to define them more in a minute, but it's important to know for your stress biology that these are not things that just happen in the moment, but they also happen through your memory of these events, as well as your anticipation of these events in the future. So one form of race-based stress is perceived racial discrimination. This is the observation or anticipation of unfair treatment based on race, ethnicity. And perhaps not surprisingly, youth of color, and particularly Black and Latinx youth, report more discrimination than their non-Hispanic white peers. Another form of race-based stress that some of you will have heard of and some may have not is stereotype threat. And this is the stress of wanting to perform well in a performance or academic setting to overcome negative expectations of one's racial ethnic group. So there are negative stereotypes regarding the academic performance of certain racial ethnic groups. And the presence and activation of those stereotypes actually makes the testing or performance situation even more stressful and places a cognitive load on individuals and affects performance through that additional stereotype threat stress. So our hypothesis or our argument is that beyond the many structural contributors to disadvantage among minoritized youth, the psychological stress associated with being a member of a minoritized racial ethnic group and the biological responses elicited by that stress may be one factor contributing to race-based health and achievement gaps. So this is a theoretical model that's just a little more specific to these pathways. And this was published in American Psychologist, if you want to read that article in more detail. So we argue that race-based social stress, as well as race-based resources, have implications for both emotional and physiological or biological stress responses, which in turn have implications for academic performance and attainment, as well as physical and mental health outcomes. And over the long run, this can lead to workforce disparities as well. And all of that is affected, of course, like I said, with the larger model, this is all embedded in larger structures and larger structures of opportunity and bias. So here's where we get to the details of the stress biology that you may not know about, and some of you may know about. But this is the daily rhythm of cortisol, which is that stress hormone that I study. And when you wake up in the morning, your cortisol levels are high. And follow the black line first here, and as you're listening to me talk, you wake up with high levels of cortisol. It surges to even higher for the first 30 to 40 minutes post-awakening, and then drops dramatically throughout the rest of the day. Now, this is not here by accident. This is actually really important and functional. So the high levels at waking, cortisol is a stress hormone, yes, but it also plays this basic rhythm, a basal rhythm, as we call it, or diurnal rhythm. There's a lot of names for it. This plays an important role in kind of regulation of attention, energy, and particularly energetic resources across the day, because cortisol releases glucose into the bloodstream. So when you wake up with high levels, that's actually associated with higher energy, and it helps to overcome the kind of the sleepiness of having just been asleep, and that surge also prepares you for the demands of the day and for the energetic demands of the day. In fact, on days that you're anticipating a more stressful day, perhaps this morning when I was thinking ahead to this talk, you have a larger surge in that cortisol awakening response and that cortisol post-awakening that helps to prepare you for the upcoming demands. And then it drops off to low levels at night to kind of prepare the body for sleep. Now, under chronic stress, you actually see a bit of a loss or a flattening of this daily cortisol rhythm. And so that's represented by that red dashed line in this figure. And we've studied a lot of different ways that different factors that contribute to these flatter diurnal cortisol rhythms. Some of the things we found is that chronic loneliness, chronic peer stress, high levels of family stress or conflict, a lot of negative life events piling up, chronic high levels of negative emotion, as well as depression and anxiety are associated with these flatter diurnal cortisol rhythms. And also a poor night of sleep is associated with a flatter rhythm. And this in turn, so you have this flatter rhythm, but that is in turn associated with these behavioral outcomes: greater fatigue, worse executive functioning, worse mental and physical health. And we actually have a meta-analysis linking the diurnal cortisol rhythms to a wide variety of different health outcomes. So imagine how concerning it was when we also found that students of color had these flatter diurnal cortisol rhythms with lower levels at waking, not so much the higher levels at bedtime, but definitely these lower levels of weight at waking. And I know everybody wants, when you hear low cortisol or low stress hormone levels, to think that this is a better thing. But as I said, these rhythms are functional. And so it's not that you want lower stress hormone levels in the morning. You actually want robust high levels in the morning and low levels at night. And so it's the flatter rhythm, that lower level at waking and higher level at bedtime that's associated with negative outcomes. So we were concerned to see these racial ethnic differences in cortisol across the waking day. We see this in adolescents, we see this in adult populations. It's been replicated in research labs across the states and also in minoritized groups in other countries around the world. And so this is not a built-in sort of biological difference. We know that race is a social construct. And indeed, the flattening of the rhythm is associated, it's the experience of race ethnicity that's associated with the flattening of this rhythm. So racial ethnic discrimination in adolescence is associated with a flatter cortisol rhythm. And in this graph, it's hard to see all the details, but that line that stands out above the others are youth of color exposed to high levels of discrimination. So that you see they have those lower levels in the morning, if I can get my cursor going here, lower levels in the morning and higher levels at night. And we were interested in, this is how recent adolescent discrimination relates to cortisol rhythms. We started to wonder how a lifetime or a cumulative exposure to discrimination would impact cortisol rhythms. And so we actually found a research study in which they'd been following adolescents from age 11, and they were now in their early 30s. And we measured, there was 20 years of prospective data on racial discrimination. And we measured stress hormones in adulthood. And this is what the stress hormone rhythms look like for the adults that were exposed to high levels of racial discrimination during adolescence. And so this low, flat rhythm, again, you might want to think that low and flat is good, but this is really a rhythm that is concerning. So these low flat rhythms were found for African Americans who had high levels of racial discrimination during adolescence. And interestingly, I don't have the graph here, but discrimination during early adulthood, was not as strongly associated with a flat diurnal rhythm. So it was really kind of a sensitive period effect where it's the adolescent exposure to discrimination that mattered. And I'm happy to, in discussion, talk about why we think that's the case. So again, we found this flatter diurnal cortisol slope and lower waking cortisol levels in Blacks with high racial discrimination. And actually whites that reported discrimination also had flatter rhythms, but they didn't have this low flat profile that is really concerning. And again, now these are very preliminary data, but linking now to some academic outcomes in the same sample. So we have 20 years of data on discrimination, and then we have adult academic outcomes measured. We find that, again, it's adolescent discrimination that's associated with lower adult educational attainment. The first column, first row is adult average years of education. Second one is high school graduation rates, college graduation, and also income. And you can see that discrimination during adolescence is associated with negative outcomes on all those factors, either significantly or near significantly. But young adult discrimination is not, except for this impacts on income. So again, we're seeing a kind of critical or sensitive period effect that adolescent discrimination really matters for for stress biology and also for academic outcomes. So what do we do about race-based stress disparities? These results paint a bit of a grim picture of race-based stress disparities and their association with both adolescent and adult outcomes. And so there are two major approaches we can think about. One is reducing stress exposures, reducing exposure to racial discrimination, and certainly that is something that should be considered and should be attempted. It's very, very difficult to accomplish in modern US society right now. To eliminate exposure to discrimination is probably the ultimate ideal, but it is not easy to accomplish. So in the meantime, one thing we've focused on doing is bolstering available resources for coping with stress, and in particular for coping with race-based stress. Although we have other interventions that are like meditation and interventions that are for coping with general sources of stress as well. So what resources, individual, institutional, cultural, might protect or against or reduce the impact of adolescent racial discrimination? Well, one thing that jumped out of the literature at us was ethnic racial identity. So ethnic racial identity is a multidimensional construct, and this is defined by Adriana Amanya Taylor, who is our collaborator on the project I'm about to discuss. Ethnic racial identity is a multidimensional construct that reflects the beliefs and attitudes that individuals have about their ethnic racial group memberships, as well as the processes by which these beliefs and attitudes develop over time. And given limited time, I won't show you the measures of ERI, but they certainly ask about feelings regarding your ethnicity, the strength of your connection to your ethnicity, as well as ethnic, racial, cultural traditions that you might be a part of. And in that longitudinal study that we talked about, the 20-year longitudinal study, we did have measures of ERI throughout the 20 years, and we actually found that strong positive ethnic racial identity was associated with partial reversal of that low cortisol, especially for young adults of color. And actually, in this case, it was both the adolescent and the young adult promotion of ERI high levels of ERI that were associated with better outcomes, including higher cortisol levels, which again is good because those levels were too low, as well as higher levels of college graduation. ERI, and this was true actually for both white and Black young adults, but the effects were a little stronger for adults of color. All right, so this finding and this general body of work led us to think about, this is entirely correlational. So how do we know that it isn't, that it isn't just, youth that have a strong ERI, are better functioning, have better functioning families, et cetera, et cetera. So we set about to actually go see if we could promote ERI in an experimental way in adolescents in school-based settings. And so this study is the bio study. There are many collaborators listed there. The Spencer Foundation, and I won't say exactly what schools we're in, but shout out to some people on this call that might have helped us with this study. The bio study is a randomized controlled trial of an intervention designed to promote ethnic and racial identity exploration in high school students. And we gathered data on 300 high school freshmen from 4 diverse high schools in the area. The students were randomized to either an ethnic racial identity workshop or an academic and career pathways workshop. And both had similar amounts of attention from facilitators. It was a classroom-based curriculum delivered either after school in some schools or in school in other schools. And 5 weeks in some schools, 10 weeks in others, always the same amount of content, but we adapted it to the school setting. The content was presented to a universal group of students. Black, white, and brown students all learned this content together and participated in the exercises, and it was guided by a trained facilitator. The next iteration of this study is actually teacher training. So we're training teachers to deliver deliver this curriculum as well. And happy to get into more detail on the curriculum during the Q&A, but we just wanted to show you the study design, which is that we have measured baseline surveys as well as baseline cognition. We had baseline stress biology, but that just ended up being too complicated for the students. So we have baseline surveys, cognition measures, then we implemented the interventions, and then we did follow-up measures, and this was all in the freshman year of high school. The follow-up in the at the end of freshman year after the interventions, in which we measured stress biology, follow-up surveys, cognitive measures, and then we've continued to follow youth for multiple years since, and so we're still analyzing that long-term outcome data. So we're going to present some preliminary results here, and these are still kind of in progress. None of these are published yet, but they're in preparation. So any feedback, thoughts you have, we are more than welcome. So we looked at racial disparities in outcomes, as well as the effects of discrimination on outcomes, as well as the effect of the intervention on outcomes. And so starting first with the effects of racial disparities and the effects of discrimination, we did find racial disparities in sleep, with youth of color getting nearly a half-hour less weeknight sleep than their white peers. And this arose primarily from wake times, with students of color waking up 22 minutes earlier on school days. Students of color also received lower quality of sleep, more nights of short sleep, which is particularly problematic, less than 6.5 hours of sleep. And we found that racial discrimination, both educational sources of discrimination, institutional as peer sources of discrimination, all helped to account for the shorter sleep of students of color. Didn't fully account for it, but accounted for, 10 to 15% of the variance in 10 to 15% of the sleep disparities that we observed. We also looked at racial discrimination in cortisol and found, as per in prior studies, educational and peer discrimination were associated with those flatter diurnal cortisol slopes, and also with a lower cortisol awakening response. And if you remember, those high morning, that cortisol awakening response is something that helps you with your get up and go and clearing your head for the demands of the day. So these patterns in past studies have been associated with fatigue and worse cognitive performance. And indeed, in this study, we actually haven't yet linked the cortisol to the cognitive performance, but we have linked to discrimination to cognitive performance. So when we look at racial discrimination in relation to our executive functioning tasks, we find that there's worse performance associated with higher racial discrimination, and also with higher stereotype threat. And the task we've got here is just an example of the many tasks we implemented. This is the Trails task, where you have to first, just in the Trails A, join the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then in Trails B, you have to connect 1A, 2B, 3C, et cetera, down the alphabet. So I myself have find this task quite challenging. And we do find racial differences in discrimination, and also in this stereotype threat. So as might be expected, white individuals report experiencing less cognitive load when they're completing tasks such as this, as compared to Black and other students of color. When we turn to the intervention effects, we were successful in promoting ethnic racial exploration, one aspect of racial ethnic identity. And this it's a little hard to see in this graph, but the students of color, and this is very apparent from when you're giving the workshops as well, the students of color come in with a more advanced racial ethnic identity development than the white students. But both white and students of color gain from being in the cultural racial ethnic identity promotion intervention. And that's a significant effect on exploration compared to the control group, in the intervention compared to the control group. We do find evidence for impacts on cortisol. And in particular for the white students, they responded to the intervention by having these higher cortisol awakening responses, which if you remember is that kind of get up and go response, but it's interpreted as kind of more of a physiological challenge response. And we're still kind of unpacking and analyzing these cortisol data. The most interesting findings so far are that the sleep findings, we do find that there were disparities in sleep prior to in the control group and then prior to the intervention, as we showed previously, but those differences have disappeared in the treatment group. So we want to obviously replicate this finding before writing home about it too much, but it's pretty profound lessening of disparities in sleep as a result of this RCT intervention. Finally, on academic outcomes, we've been disappointed so far, and I won't unpack all the details of this graph, but we haven't found an impact on short-term academic outcomes yet, and mixed impacts on the executive functioning as well. So we're still really analyzing that, and what we're thinking is that we might see effects not in the short term, but in the long-term outcomes, academic outcomes. So stay tuned for additional examination of that. In summary, there are disparities in stress exposure on multiple dimensions, and including race, which was the dimension we focused on today. There's disparities in other dimensions, such as socioeconomic status, that can also be the subject of research. But today we're focused on race-based stress disparities. And the race-based stress disparities do have implications for stress biology, for cognition, and for academic outcomes. But bolstering race-based resources, such as ethnic racial identity development, can have positive implications for that stress biology and for cognitive functioning. And we're hoping in the long term it will also have impacts on academic outcomes. So with that, I will thank you all for your attention, and would be happy to take questions, as will Sarah also be happy to take your questions. We talked about dividing up the presentation and decided I would do it, but Sarah will jump on for questions. So thank you. Any questions, comments?
Folks, feel free to use the raise your hand function. You can put a written question in the Q&A or in the chat. We're watching it all, so however you want to ask your question. I think it would also be cool if there are comments from any of our school district partners on the call who just about how they're thinking about stress in their own school districts and their sort of practitioner roles. We'd love to hear about that too. So questions and comments, absolutely welcome.
Is everybody just shocked by the biological the biological stress? I find it we're all kind of aware of it, but it's pretty stark to see pictures of it.
Walter is asking, this may be a silly question, but is there a possible pharmaceutical solution to help?
That is a beautiful question. And there is some companies that are working on regulating cortisol, but the way that and it will, it's hopeful for when you have severe dysregulation of cortisol, such as in Cushing's syndrome, or there's disorders where your cortisol is like way sky high or way low, and the pharmaceutical approaches to that are very helpful. The problem with pharmaceutical regulation of these daily rhythms, and one thing we didn't show you, is that not only do you have these daily rhythms, but also if there's an event throughout the day that you experience, it gives you a little blip in cortisol that helps you deal with that everyday event. So there's both. Also, those daily rhythms shift from day to day, so that depending on the daily demands, and I think I mentioned that. So the problem with a pharmaceutical fix is that it might squash the rhythm down or elevate the rhythm, but it doesn't give you the intricate regulation and elasticity and plasticity and all the rhythm is the whole cortisol as an HPA axis, and most stress systems are intended to delicately and intricately respond to challenge. And if you were to you can't pharmaceutically, it's very difficult, let's say, to pharmaceutically mimic the natural responsivity that the system has to everyday experiences. And in doing so, you would probably end up creating one of those more exhaustion profiles by dampening, either dampening or too much elevating the rhythm. So I don't know, that may have been too much information. So yes, people are working on it, but it's why don't we instead remove the stress or bolster the resources? That is my argument. It's yeah. So adding another drug is probably not my first choice of as an intervention.
We have a question from Sandra that was super informative. I work with elementary and see this anxiety/stress happening happening since kindergarten. Wondering what type of support/regulation can we bring to our classroom, both for students and educators?
Absolutely. So this is part of the presentation I was saying, but before I got on, that I had like a presentation that was twice as long and realized that it was 2 times too long. So I cut out this slide that has a list of stressors and a list of supports. And so, as I said, with the racial discrimination, you can regulate things by reducing exposure to stress or bolstering supports. What those supports would look like is going to vary depending on the age of the child. For adolescents, what's going to be helpful, it's going to be slightly different than for younger children. And so in a classroom with younger children, basically, and this is a general message, anything that bolsters feelings of belonging and safety are going to really, our biological stress systems were built to respond to danger. And so to the extent you can make children feel safe in your classroom and feel a sense of belonging, in humans as a social animal, belonging is safety, right? Because we're there to protect each other. And so there's ways to manipulate the physical environment of the classroom to create kind of for very young kids, kindergarten age kids, to create kind of safe, quiet spaces. But also just warmth and affection from parents is really important, but warmth and affection and from teachers, and being careful to include everybody in the conversation. So I mean, I'm not an educator. I'd love to I'm an educator of college age students, but I would love to hear other people's ideas. I do have a list again on a slide the other thing I would say is that sleep is really important as a regulator so not only is sleep stress sensitive, but if you regulate sleep better, if kids get more regular sleep and sleep when their bodies want sleep, it's associated with regulation of stress biology, regulation of emotion. And so school start times, there's policy solutions such as modifying school start times, but also helping parents to know that regular bedtimes and wake times matter. And things like, we have other interventions like mindfulness and meditation interventions. Those are again for a little older kids, but I know that there's kind of yoga and mindfulness type interventions for younger kids as well. So there's multiple avenues, but I think if you kind of keep the focus on safety and security and feelings of belonging, there's that is one guidepost. Yeah.
Fantastic. And Sandra in the chat is saying, I wonder if the correlation of strong MTS and school culture and cortisol levels, which Sarah says sounds like a great research, MTSS, thank you. As I was saying it, I was like, wait, that's not right. Sarah, I know you've done research and have looked into start times and daylight savings time. Do you want to talk at all about some of that research and how schools can plug in?
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Yeah, one of my lines of work that's also supported and informed by work that Emma and other members of our lab have done over the years considers how factors like school start times and ensuring that as best as possible, both the school day and the timing of like low stakes or high stakes assessments for students are happening at a time of day where they're going to be most energized and kind of best primed to, to do their best thinking or learning. So that's something that I'm interested in and have, proposed to look at, and I'm actively looking at both in the IRD data and in some other ways. And those of you in California might be familiar with the new requirement that primarily affects school start times for middle school and high school students, where for younger kids, they tend to wake up earlier and be ready for an earlier school day. So for some, that means elementary school starting a little bit earlier. But that is one strategy to kind of optimize like student well-being in the classroom. I don't know if I have too much to say besides that, but just echoing, and I have young kids who are in a daycare setting, so I'm acutely aware of the importance of sensitive and warm caregivers in that 2, 3, 4-year-old age group setting as well. You can really see the difference it makes.
In addition to the school start times, transport to school matters. So in another study, we found that, again, like in this study, kids of color were getting up earlier than other kids. And a lot of it had to do not so much, it wasn't that they were going to bed later, as they're getting up earlier and taking more time to get to school. We didn't have details of that, but whether it's bus routes or whether it's, just the fact that they have less access to convenient transportation, or parents driving them to school, or perhaps making multiple stops. So there's multiple things to consider that are kind of the more practical policy solutions, in addition to these more emotional, psychological solutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
How malleable are cortisol patterns over the course of childhood? Like we were just talking about early childhood experience. Would an adverse experience early on like have a permanent impact on that, or is it something that through therapy or more positive experiences as a child gets older can return? Just how much of it is just sort of a I guess how important are those early years in setting the course?
Absolutely. So there is a huge amount of research on adverse childhood experiences and how they affect stress biology and how they affect long-term health outcomes. One of the reasons that I've chosen to look at adolescence and interventions in adolescence is that I don't believe it's all over. These biological systems are designed for flexibility. And adolescence is a time when there's a lot of change in these biological systems again. And when we talk about it like reshuffling the deck, it's a time when there's so much changing anyway, it gives you a chance to integrate positive change for the better. So a lot of these things are reversible with positive experience. I think part of the problem is that the initial negative adverse experience tends to set up ongoing exposure to both be associated with, but also set up ongoing exposure to negative environments. So this is why, kids that have had adverse experiences may have some behavioral difficulties, which lets them perhaps not have as positive an experience in the school setting. So it's like as with anything, where you need to actively counter those negative influences by with positive ones, and have patience and persistence and lots of resources to do it. But there is reversibility of these systems. So I think that that's really a positive message. I know that the adverse in childhood experience literature is like this racial disparities literature, pretty grim, but that's why a lot of us have turned to focusing on what we can do, and there is reversibility.
Some of this, Paul, this is just so fascinating and so interesting. I have an observation and then a question. The observation is that in many districts around the country, including our local districts here in Evanston, there's been an increase in programs for social emotional learning and
Yeah.
racial equity,
Mhm.
identity training. So that's fantastic. It seems like your work and then the work of your colleagues in your lab should be front and center at places like CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And I'm on the board, the National Board of Campus, so I can actually help make that connection because it's
Yeah.
and it also makes it's sort of interesting to think about the number of SEL programs that are out there, and there might be for some of your lab partners places to actually do the type of study using those interventions and to see whether or not they have an impact at all.
Yeah.
So happy to make that connection. The question was, you mentioned that you would potentially in the Q&A talk about the curriculum, and I'm wondering if you can, you or Sarah can unpack that a little bit so that we can understand that a little bit more.
Sure. So this curriculum was designed by Adriana Manya Taylor out of Harvard University. And she spent many years studying ethnic identity development in youth of color and in white youth, and spent probably 10 years putting together this curriculum, and it is manualized. I mean, more than 10 years. She spent her career putting together this curriculum through research, studying past efforts, as well as theoretically informing it based on the research she's done. So that said, it involves ideally about 8 weeks and about an hour and a half a week. Sarah, tell me if I'm getting this wrong. I believe that's right. And it is manualized. So and it I could somewhere I have a slide that has all the different what they do in the different weeks. But it, the first it's in the class, ideally delivered in the classroom setting. We've delivered it both in the after school setting and in a classroom setting. Obviously, the fidelity is stronger when it's delivered in the classroom. But it involves things like thinking about your identity and the role of your racial and your ethnic background in your identity, learning about racial discrimination and its impacts, and studying historical examples of discrimination in the United States that includes discrimination against white individuals, as well as the terrible historic and current discrimination against students of color. It involved doing things like interviewing an elder in your family about the meaning of race, ethnicity to them, going around your house and taking pictures of cultural artifacts, doing a family tree. And Sarah, is there other ones? What other exercises I'm forgetting?
I think those are the most important ones, and that's, I think, one of the coolest sort of aspects of the curriculum is that it helps students bridge like their home context with this kind of more school-based context. So by taking the photos and like dialoguing with their families, and then the final week is like a potluck that parents and guardians are invited to as well. And I think students are always like, oh, this is gonna be so awkward, like the 19 of us and like a smattering of adults and like the facilitators kind of all in the room. And then like, I was going to say without fail, I read all the survey responses because I clean and manage the data. And when we ask like kind of highs and lows or feedback on the curriculum, the single most common thing is that they liked the food party at the end. And so I think once kind of the ice is broken and people are happy to be there, there's like some really interesting and valuable kind of debrief about the experience. And so I think being able to kind of bridge the home dialogue about family and culture and ethnicity and race with whatever their kind of like school dialogue and what they've built over the course of the program. Like, to me, that's a pretty novel and really like promising, I guess, aspect of it.
Yeah. The other part that I like is the artifact from the study that I really like is the I am and I am not cards. It has on one side what they are, and then on the other side what they're not, and one part of it is done with respect to your ethnicity and race. And so it's revealing stereotypes, but then also revealing the uniquenesses of everybody in the classroom and sharing those with each other. And so I ideally really like to think that this intervention, because it's delivered as a universal intervention with white, black, and brown kids in the classroom talking about these things at the same time, we actually have a suspicion that it's short-term stressful. You're starting to see some of those stress hormone elevations, particularly in the white kids. But we haven't yet followed it to the long term, but because we think that initial stress is important of encountering this curriculum is important to crystallize into a new kind of state, so that it, you know, there is a little kind of disruption to later resolution. But it is really, we like to think also, and we're studying this, that by everybody talking about these issues together, again, it's a little stressful in the moment for them, but we hope that they take that out of that room to an ability of greater comfort in interacting with students, and, you know, at deeper levels of different racial ethnic backgrounds than themselves. And seeing the, you know, one thing they delve into is not just their, you know, is their ethnic heritage, and that, you know, and so you know, one memory, one of my favorite memories when I participated in a group was, I have some French Canadian background, and so I ended up in a small group with a student, an African American, or a African American student from a French speaking country, whose family immigrated from a French-speaking country, and it was just this funny and kind of like, oh, we're we're in a cultural group together, and so I think that there's I think it surprises people into realizing that there's all sorts of different forms of belonging together that doesn't follow along kind of visible characteristics or lines. So.
Yeah, something else that was kind of cool about the context of doing this in our local area that is a little bit different from where, like, Adriana Amanya-Taylor was in Arizona when she first developed the curriculum, and then implementing it in the Chicagoland area. We had a number of students who identify as Jewish, whose families are Jewish, and who, you know, mentioned that in their intake surveys. But then, as I could then go and observe their surveys after, they were writing in their, like, race and ethnic identity, like, I'm white and I'm Jewish, and really, like, foregrounding and describing that, like, cultural and ethnic piece of their experience. And we didn't think to study that specifically, like, at the outset. So there's going to be kind of limited research insight that we can offer, like, with this round of research, but it's something that I'd be interested to see in another version of this going forward in the future, because I think understanding how students who are white but who have connection to, you know, various refugee experiences, different types of discrimination, to, you know, to being Jewish or to other, you know, cultural or religious elements that are subject to discrimination. Like, there's some really interesting layers of how people can kind of deepen and appreciate what culture and ethnicity mean to them. So that was a really cool, like, sort of unexpected insight for me personally from this project.
Yeah, and as we move into different schools with this work, and by the way, if anybody's really interested in this work for their school district, or we're starting to really think about the next layer of teacher training that we're going to do to roll this out, and there is some funding available to do that. So yeah, so as we get into different school districts with students of different backgrounds and characteristics, you know, there's lots of really interesting surprises that probably shouldn't be surprises to us, but I think you know, the intervention so far has held up really well over very diverse contexts. Any other questions or comments? Are you all going to send me your spit now to know how stressed you are?
I think we might have some people who are very interested in seeing that curriculum and using it. So if that's something we can share afterwards, that would be.
Please do. Please do. Yeah, we're really interested. So right now we're still wanting to do it as a randomized control trial, which may make things trickier, but whatever your situation, if you're interested in it, please contact me, and I'll you know, put you in touch with Adriana, and or she and I together are thinking about next steps for research on this, and for eventually, you know, getting it out there. It doesn't all have to be research, of course. We really want the curriculum to be available broadly. It just takes a couple of research steps to be able to particularly in the current climate of thinking and talking about race, ethnicity, having the research-based evidence that this is effective is helpful in countering some challenges to ethnic racial curricula in high schools. So that's part of our goal in this.
I had a question. Something I found so interesting was when you said that it's not just discrimination, but the memory of it or the anticipation of it happening in the future. And I was thinking about the nature of memory as not just ending with the individual and sort of all of this research and writing about generational trauma. And I wondered how researchers have looked at generational trauma and cortisol or sleep or other measures of stress.
Yeah, well, they have, you know, I mean, certainly just the memory and I mean, certainly those conversations with, you know, elders in the family and also racial social, I'm actually working on a paper right now on the idea, again, that racial socialization of kids by their parents and or teachers may be stressful in the short term, but shows positive outcomes in the long term. And there's quite a lot of evidence for that. So, but there's other studies of intergenerational trauma and stress exposure that there's one study showing prenatal stress, racial discrimination is associated with cortisol reactivity in the infants. So that some of it is there's even prenatal, mechanisms for the transmission of this trauma, as well as memory and behavioral based kind of transmission of this trauma. And then don't forget all the other structural things that contribute as well. So you place, you know, this also in the structural context that is disadvantaged. Yeah. Thank you all for your attention and really interested. Certainly, if you have thoughts, feedback, or interest, please don't hesitate to reach out.